Laura Mitchell's life had always seemed like the fulfillment of every dream she had as a young girl. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had always imagined a future filled with love, family, and stability. At 22, just out of college, she met Robert Mitchell, a man nearly 10 years older than her. He was charming, successful, and had an air of certainty about life that she found intoxicating. He had been working as an accountant for a large firm in New York at the time, and Laura was swept up in his world. Fancy dinners, weekend getaways, and promises of a future she had always dreamed about. It wasn't long before they were married and moved to Connecticut, where Robert accepted a senior role in a prestigious accounting firm, giving them the kind of financial security Laura had never experienced growing up. By the time Laura was 38, she had settled into her role as a devoted wife and mother of two teenagers, Emma and Alex. Emma, the older of the two at 16, had inherited her mother's blonde hair and outgoing personality, while Alex, at 14, was more reserved like his father. The family lived in a large colonial house in an upscale suburban neighborhood, surrounded by well-manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a sense of safety that could lull anyone into complacency. On the outside, their lives seemed perfect. Robert's career had flourished and he was often praised for his dedication and professionalism. Laura had taken a break from her career in marketing when the children were born, choosing instead to focus on raising them and managing the household. She spent her days volunteering at the kids' schools, organizing charity events, and ensuring their home was always immaculate. The neighbors admired Laura, seeing her as the epitome of a devoted wife and mother. But under the surface, things were far from perfect. The cracks in Laura and Robert's marriage had started to show years ago, though they had both become experts at hiding them. Robert's long hours at work had taken their toll, and when he was home, he was often distant, absorbed in his phone or emails. Their conversations were short, transactional even, focused on logistics like who would pick up the kids or when the next mortgage payment was due. The passion that had once fueled their relationship had long since burned out, leaving only the cold ashes of routine behind. Laura often found herself reminiscing about the early days of their relationship, when Robert would surprise her with flowers, or they would spend entire weekends in bed, talking about their dreams for the future. But those days were gone, replaced by the monotony of suburban life. Laura's identity had become so wrapped up in being a wife and mother that she hardly recognized herself anymore. She missed feeling desired, missed the thrill of new love and the excitement of the unknown. Lately, Laura had been feeling a deep, unsettling restlessness. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that this was just part of life, part of getting older, but it was becoming harder to ignore the nagging sense that something was missing. Robert seemed oblivious to her growing dissatisfaction, and any attempts to talk about it were quickly brushed aside. He had always been a man of few words, but now the emotional distance between them felt like a chasm she couldn't cross. She longed for someone to notice her again, to see her as something more than just a mother and a housewife. It was during this time of growing frustration and loneliness that Jacob Matthews entered their lives. Jacob was 21, the son of Robert's new business partner, and he had just moved back into his parents' house after finishing college. His family lived only a few houses down the street, and it wasn't long before the Mitchells crossed paths with him. Laura first met Jacob at a neighborhood barbecue, one of those casual suburban events where everyone pretends to be more interested in each other's lives than they really are. Jacob was handsome in that effortless way that only comes with youth, tall, with dark, wavy hair and a confident smile. He had the energy and ambition that reminded Laura of her younger self, and something about him caught her attention immediately. The first time they spoke, it was innocent enough, just small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, and how Jacob was adjusting to being back home. But there was an undercurrent to their conversation that Laura couldn't ignore. He was charming, flirtatious even, and she found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't felt in years. At first, Laura brushed it off as harmless. After all, She was almost twice Jacob's age. Surely, he didn't see her that way. But as the weeks went by, their interactions became more frequent. Jacob would stop by the house under the pretense of discussing business with Robert, but it was clear that his real interest was in Laura. He would linger after their conversations, his eyes locking with hers for just a moment too long, his hand brushing against hers when he handed her a drink. Each time, Laura felt a jolt of excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't long before their casual conversations turned into something more. One afternoon, when Robert was at work and the kids were at school, Jacob stopped by unannounced. Laura knew she should have told him to leave, but instead, she invited him in. They sat in the kitchen, talking about everything and nothing at all, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. And then, without thinking, Laura leaned in and kissed him. It was a brief, impulsive moment, but it changed everything. From that point on, Laura was consumed by her affair with Jacob. They met in secret, finding moments when they could be alone without anyone suspecting. At first, it was exhilarating. For the first time in years, Laura felt alive, desired, and important. Jacob was young and passionate, and he made her feel like the center of his world. She convinced herself that what they had was special, that it was different from the mundane reality of her life with Robert. But with each passing week, the weight of her deception grew heavier. Laura knew what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't stop. She had become addicted to the thrill of sneaking around, to the feeling of being wanted. But with that thrill came paranoia. Every time Robert came home early or asked her a seemingly innocent question, Laura's heart would race. She constantly felt like she was on the verge of being caught, and the guilt gnawed at her. She started having nightmares about Robert finding out, about her life falling apart. But no matter how much she feared the consequences, she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. As the affair continued, Laura became more and more distant from Robert. She no longer had the energy to keep up the facade of their perfect marriage. Robert noticed the change in her but assumed it was just the stress of raising teenagers and managing the household. He didn't push her for answers, and in some ways, that made it worse. Laura wished he would notice, wished he would confront her so she wouldn't have to keep lying. But Robert remained oblivious, and Laura was left to navigate her double life alone. One evening, Laura and Robert were invited to a dinner party at the Matthews house. It was a casual gathering, just a few neighbors and friends, but the tension between Laura and Jacob was palpable. Throughout the night, Laura could feel Jacob's eyes on her, and she had to make a conscious effort not to look back at him. Every touch of Robert's hand felt like a betrayal, and by the end of the night, Laura was on edge, barely able to contain her emotions. As the weeks went by, the situation became even more precarious. Jacob was growing bolder, no longer content with stolen moments and secret rendezvous. He began texting Laura more frequently, often late at night, and she had to be careful to delete the messages before Robert could see them. It felt like she was living on borrowed time, each day bringing her closer to the inevitable moment when everything would come crashing down. But for now, the affair remained a secret, buried beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. Laura told herself she could handle it, that she could keep the two parts of her life separate. But deep down, she knew the truth, that the cracks in her marriage, the lies she was telling, and the guilt she carried would eventually destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. And as Jacob's presence in her life grew stronger, so too did the storm brewing just on the horizon, waiting to shatter the illusion of happiness that Laura had so carefully constructed. Laura Mitchell's life had become a web of lies. Each day, she found herself slipping further into a world she barely recognized. What had started as a single impulsive moment, a kiss with Jacob Matthews, had spiraled into something she could no longer control. The thrill of the affair had intoxicated her at first, but now, weeks into their secret relationship, the excitement was tinged with something darker, fear. Jacob was young, unpredictable, and increasingly demanding of her time and attention. What Laura had thought would be a brief fling, a way to recapture the passion and excitement she had been missing in her marriage, was becoming far more complicated. Jacob had become infatuated, sending her messages at all hours, asking to see her more often, and becoming frustrated when she couldn't meet. At first, Laura had found his eagerness flattering, but now it felt suffocating. Every time Laura received one of his texts, her heart raced, not with excitement, but with fear of getting caught. She had to be meticulous, deleting messages immediately, and making sure her phone was always locked when she was around Robert. The paranoia consumed her. Even the most mundane conversations with Robert now felt like a minefield. When he asked about her day, she wondered if he was fishing for clues, if he already suspected something was going on. She had never been good at lying, and it took everything she had to maintain the appearance of normalcy. One afternoon, while Robert was at work and the children were at school, Jacob texted her, asking to meet. Laura hesitated. She knew she should stop, end things before they went too far, but the pull was too strong. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They met at a small park outside the neighborhood, a place where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. Jacob was already there when she arrived, leaning casually against his car, his dark hair falling into his eyes in that effortless way that had first drawn her to him. Laura felt a pang of guilt as she approached him, but the guilt was quickly overshadowed by the rush of adrenaline that always accompanied their meetings. As soon as she was close enough, Jacob pulled her into a kiss, his hand sliding around her waist. Laura responded automatically, her body betraying the conflict raging inside her mind. She knew she had to end this, but every time she tried, Jacob's touch made her forget why. They spent an hour together, talking about nothing in particular. Jacob's conversation was always light, rarely touching on anything serious. He would joke, flirt, and make her feel like the center of his universe, and for a while, Laura could pretend that nothing else mattered. But today, something was different. Jacob was restless, distracted. When Laura asked him what was wrong, he hesitated, glancing away before answering. I hate having to sneak around all the time," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "Why can't we just be together without all this hiding?" Laura's stomach twisted. This was exactly what she had been dreading. She had known this moment was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Jacob, you know why," she said gently. "I have a family. I can't just leave them. What we have, it has to stay like this." Jacob's expression darkened. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers for something, though Laura wasn't sure what. When he spoke again, his voice was harder. "Maybe that's fine for you, but I can't keep doing this forever, Laura. I need more." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of implication. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to say something, to reassure him, but she couldn't. She knew she had already given him more than she should have, and now she was trapped. Before she could respond, Jacob stood up abruptly. "I'll see you later," he muttered, his tone colder than before. Laura watched as he walked away, her mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had imagined a brief affair, something to fill the emptiness she had been feeling. Not this, not an ultimatum. As she drove home, the weight of her situation pressed down on her. Jacob was becoming a problem, one that she wasn't sure how to solve. Over the next few days, Laura tried to distance herself from Jacob. She ignored his texts, telling herself it was for the best, that she had to stop before things got even more out of control. But Jacob didn't take her silence well. The messages became more frequent, more insistent. He started showing up at her house unannounced, under the pretense of talking to Robert about business. Every time, Laura's stomach would knot with anxiety. One evening, Robert came home earlier than expected. Laura had been in the living room, cleaning up after dinner, when she heard his car pull into the driveway. Panic shot through her as she glanced at her phone, where a message from Jacob was still on the screen. "I'm coming over. Need to see you." Laura scrambled to delete the message, her hands trembling as she quickly wiped the screen and shoved her phone into her pocket. Just as she finished, the front door opened and Robert walked in, looking tired but otherwise unaware of the chaos running through her mind. He gave her a distracted smile, setting his briefcase down by the door. "Hey," he said, his voice neutral as usual. "Long day. How was yours?" "Fine," Laura replied, her voice strained as she struggled to maintain her composure. "The usual." But before Robert could respond, there was a knock at the door. Laura's heart stopped. She already knew who it was, and for a moment, she thought about pretending she hadn't heard it. But Robert was already walking toward the door, oblivious to the terror rising in her chest. When Robert opened the door, there stood Jacob, a casual smile on his face as if nothing was wrong. Laura felt her breath catch in her throat as she waited for Robert's reaction. But to her surprise, Robert seemed unfazed. "Jacob," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "What brings you here?" Jacob's eyes flicked to Laura for just a second before he answered. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," he said smoothly. "Wanted to see if you had time to talk about that new client." Laura could hardly believe the audacity of it. She stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to get Jacob out of the house without raising suspicion. But before she could say anything, Robert gestured for Jacob to come in. "Sure, come on in," he said, completely unaware of the tension between his wife and their neighbor. "I could use a break from the emails anyway." Laura's stomach churned as she watched Jacob step inside. He shot her a brief glance, one that was impossible for Robert to see, but it sent a jolt of panic through her. She couldn't believe how calm he was, how easily he was able to hide the truth in plain sight. It was a skill Laura wished she had. The two men disappeared into Robert's study, and Laura was left alone in the kitchen, her mind racing. She tried to focus on cleaning up, but all she could think about was how close she had come to being caught. Every sound from the study made her flinch, imagining the moment when Robert might discover what was really going on. She pictured him storming out, demanding answers, and her entire world collapsing around her. After what felt like an eternity, Jacob finally left. Robert seemed in a better mood after their conversation, completely unaware of the storm that had been brewing just beneath the surface. But Laura wasn't as calm. Her nerves were frayed, and the close call had shaken her more than she was willing to admit. She knew she couldn't keep doing this, not without risking everything. Despite her best efforts, Laura couldn't stay away from Jacob. He was persistent, texting her relentlessly until she finally gave in. They met again in secret, this time at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Laura hated the place, its dim lighting, the musty smell of the carpet, and the way the walls seemed to close in around them. But it was the only place where they could be together without the risk of running into someone they knew. Their meetings had lost the excitement they once held. What had started as a passionate affair had turned into something darker, more desperate. Jacob's jealousy was becoming harder to ignore. He demanded more of Laura's time, more of her attention, and whenever she pulled back, he grew sullen and angry. The carefree charm that had first attracted her was fading, replaced by something possessive and controlling. One night, after another argument about their relationship, Jacob dropped a bombshell. He wanted her to leave Robert. He wasn't willing to be her secret anymore, and if she didn't end her marriage, he threatened to tell Robert everything himself. Laura was stunned. She had never imagined Jacob would go this far, and the thought of him confronting Robert filled her with dread. She tried to reason with him, to explain that leaving her family wasn't an option, but Jacob wasn't interested in listening. He was done hiding, done sneaking around. If Laura wasn't willing to make a choice, he would make it for her. Panic set in as Laura realized just how trapped she was. She had always known that her affair with Jacob was risky, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Jacob's ultimatum left her with no good options. If she stayed with Robert, Jacob would expose their affair, and her entire life would come crashing down. If she left Robert, she would lose everything: her family, her home, and the stability she had worked so hard to maintain. In the days that followed, Laura became a shell of her former self. She was constantly on edge, waiting for the moment when Jacob would follow through on his threat. Every time Robert looked at her, she wondered if he already knew. The stress was unbearable, and Laura found herself withdrawing from everyone around her, including her children. Emma and Alex noticed the change in their mother, but when they asked if she was okay, Laura brushed them off, telling them she was just tired. But the truth was, Laura was drowning in guilt and fear, and she had no idea how to fix the mess she had created. Jacob's demand for more had pushed her to the brink, and she was quickly running out of time to find a way out. One evening, just as Laura thought she might finally be able to breathe, Jacob showed up at her house again, this time uninvited and clearly agitated. He had been drinking, and his usual charm was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. When Laura tried to send him away, he refused to leave, insisting they needed to talk. "We're done with this game, Laura," Jacob said, his voice slurred and menacing. "You're going to tell him tonight, or I will." Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to calm him down, but nothing she said seemed to get through to him. Jacob was beyond reason, and for the first time, Laura felt genuinely afraid of him. Before she could stop him, Jacob pushed past her, heading toward Robert's study, where her husband was working late. Laura's mind raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. This was it, the moment when everything would fall apart. Laura stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, watching as Jacob stormed toward Robert's study. Her mind raced, her breath quickening as panic took hold. She knew she couldn't let Jacob reach Robert. Everything she had tried so hard to hide would come crashing down. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor, her body betraying her as fear paralyzed her into inaction. As Jacob reached for the door handle, Laura finally snapped out of her stupor. She rushed forward, grabbing his arm with more force than she realized. "Jacob, stop," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't do this." Jacob turned to face her, his eyes wild with a mix of alcohol and rage. His lips curled into a sneer as he yanked his arm free from her grip. "Why not?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You've been lying to him for months. He deserves to know the truth." Laura's heart pounded in her chest, and she struggled to find the right words. "This isn't the way, Jacob. Please, just go home. We can talk about this later." But Jacob wasn't listening. He wasn't in the mood for talking, and his patience had run out. He shoved Laura aside, his eyes locked on the study door. She stumbled back, her body slamming against the wall with a painful thud. For a moment, the wind was knocked out of her, and she gasped for breath. But she couldn't afford to stop. She had to do something. Before Jacob could open the door, Laura lunged forward again, this time putting herself between him and the entrance to Robert's study. She placed both hands against his chest, trying to push him back. "Jacob, please," she begged, her voice trembling with desperation. "You're going to ruin everything." Jacob's face twisted with anger, and he grabbed her wrists, pulling her hands away from him. "You already ruined everything, Laura," he growled. "You can't keep playing both sides forever." Laura's mind raced, trying to come up with something, anything, that would stop him. She glanced toward the study, where she could hear the faint sound of Robert typing away at his computer. He had no idea what was happening just a few feet away from him. He had no idea how close he was to discovering the ugly truth. "I'll leave him," Laura blurted out suddenly, the words tumbling from her lips before she had a chance to think them through. "I'll leave Robert. Just give me more time." Jacob froze, his grip on her wrists loosening slightly as he stared at her. For a moment, the anger in his eyes flickered into something else, something vulnerable, almost hopeful. But the moment passed quickly, and Jacob's expression hardened again. "You're lying," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been lying to me since the beginning." "I'm not lying," Laura insisted, her voice frantic. "I'll leave him. I just need to figure out how." Jacob shook his head, cutting her off. "I don't believe you," he said, his voice cold. "You've had plenty of chances to leave him, but you never do. You're too scared. You'd rather stay in your perfect little life and keep me as your dirty secret." Laura's heart sank as she realized that Jacob was right. She had been lying to him, to Robert, and to herself. She had never intended to leave her husband, not really. The affair had been an escape, a way to feel alive again, but it had spiraled out of control. Now, she was paying the price. Jacob stepped forward, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her skin. "If you won't tell him," he whispered. "I will." Laura's stomach twisted in knots as Jacob reached for the door again. In that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't let Jacob destroy everything. She couldn't let him rip apart her family, expose her shame, and ruin the lives of her children. Without thinking, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass paperweight that sat on the hallway table. Before Jacob could react, Laura swung the paperweight toward him with all the strength she could muster. It collided with the side of his head with a sickening crack. Jacob staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he raised a hand to his temple. Blood began to seep through his fingers, staining his skin a deep crimson. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Laura stared in horror at what she had done, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She hadn't meant to hit him that hard. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Jacob didn't answer. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him as he crumpled to the floor. The paperweight slipped from Laura's fingers, clattering to the ground beside his motionless body. Laura's mind went blank. The world around her blurred, and all she could hear was the deafening sound of her own heartbeat. She stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. It wasn't until she heard Robert's voice from the study that reality came crashing back down on her. "Laura." Robert called out, his voice muffled through the door. "Everything okay out there?" Laura's chest tightened, and she felt like she was about to suffocate. She had to act fast. Robert couldn't see this. He couldn't see Jacob lying on the floor, blood pooling around his head. Her hands flew to her mouth as she tried to suppress a sob. What had she done? The next few minutes passed in a blur. Laura had managed to convince Robert that everything was fine, that she had just knocked something over in the hallway. He had believed her, retreating back into his study, oblivious to the disaster unfolding just outside his door. Laura, on the other hand, was spiraling into panic. She knelt beside Jacob's body, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Jacob, please wake up." But there was no response. Jacob's chest wasn't rising, and when Laura pressed her fingers to his neck, she couldn't find a pulse. The realization hit her like a freight train. Jacob was dead. She had killed him. For a moment, Laura thought about calling the police. But then, her mind filled with the image of her children, Emma and Alex. She imagined them growing up without a mother, their lives forever scared by the knowledge that she had been responsible for a man's death. She couldn't let that happen. She had to protect them, no matter the cost. Her hands shook as she stood up, her mind racing. She couldn't just leave Jacob's body here. She had to get rid of it, hide the evidence of what she had done. But how? How could she possibly move him without Robert noticing? As she stood there, paralyzed by indecision, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. It was a message from Jacob's phone. "I'm outside. Can you come out for a minute?" Laura stared at the message, her mind spinning. Jacob had texted her just before coming inside. His phone was still in his car. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the driveway. Sure enough, Jacob's car was parked just a few feet away. An idea began to form in her mind. Desperate and reckless, she could move Jacob's body to the car, drive it somewhere far away, and make it look like an accident. It wasn't a perfect plan, far from it, but it was the only one she had. The next few hours were a nightmare. Laura moved through the motions in a daze, her body working on autopilot as her mind screamed at her to stop. She waited until Robert was asleep, then slipped out of the house. Under the cover of darkness, she dragged Jacob's lifeless body out to his car. The weight of him nearly crushed her, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain. She had no choice. Once Jacob was in the driver's seat, Laura wiped down the interior, making sure to erase any trace of herself from the vehicle. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the rag, but she forced herself to keep going. When she was done, she climbed into the passenger seat and started the engine. Her heart pounded in her chest as she drove, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see police lights flashing behind her. She drove for what felt like hours, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had done. Finally, she reached a remote stretch of road on the outskirts of town, a place where the trees grew thick and the chances of anyone finding the car were slim. With trembling hands, she positioned the car near the edge of a steep embankment. Then, with a final, desperate push, she sent the car careening over the edge. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering echoed through the night as the car tumbled down the hill, disappearing into the darkness below. Laura stood there for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched the wreckage. It was done. Jacob was gone.